So today we're really getting into the paper 3 prompt, which we talked a little bit about last Wednesday, and more specifically into drafting, because of course with this paper, you guys have a lot of choices in terms of which question or questions you guys want to respond to. And of course that gives a lot more variety in terms of the drafting and how you're going to organize to really address those different issues. So getting into that, we're going to go over specifically that prompt, have a little discussion and brainstorm in terms of how you guys plan on addressing the different questions, or specifically which questions you guys want to go over before we get into just the overarching drafting. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions, or if you want me to give you specific feedback in terms of how to organize your ideas for this paper, since of course we're moving away from a rhetorical analysis and more towards you guys assessing and presenting your own points about the moral questions in regard to cancel culture. So any questions about what we're doing today? Or thumbs up if you guys are good so we can move forward. Awesome. So to begin with, we had the prompt, which we did talk a little bit about last Wednesday. So in terms of the biggest thing for this prompt that we haven't gone over so far is how we're using these texts and how we're responding. Because of course, one thing that is really noted in this prompt is we have that intro, which is about the moral dilemmas, and we have the 3 different sources that we've read or watched and we've discussed, being Bromwich's article, Everyone is Canceled, Beauchamp's The Free Speech Debate Isn't About Free Speech, and then the CBSN's documentary, Speaking Frankly About Cancel Culture. So once you've chosen at least one of the following questions to respond to, the biggest thing that you really want to consider is how you're using examples from at least 2 of those sources. So you want to choose the 2 sources that you feel can really add to what you're going to be saying about the different, or how you're going to be responding to those individual questions. And of course, in terms of your use of the sources, right, one thing to know if we think about this as a prompt with use examples, it doesn't mean, right, that we're focusing on those examples. So in terms of this, these sources are secondary to the points that you are making in response to these questions. So that is a big difference from when we're writing a rhetorical analysis, when we're centering our analysis on those points. Now we're just using those sources in terms of how either you can respond to them in terms of challenging them, or to illustrate your points that you're making about these moral situations. So one thing to note with that, since they are secondary, right, you don't need to use them in every body paragraph. So you can pick and choose when you want to use them, what point that you are making in response to these questions, like where you want to take a quote or elaborate on an example from one of the sources, right? But so you do have more freedom there in terms of how you're using them. And of course, right, if you do want to use all 3 sources, that is an option for you. It's just not required. You just have to use at least 2 of them. And of course, the final thing for this prompt that we haven't talked about, so the paper is supposed to be at least 3 to 4 pages in length, so 3 full pages. But if you do go longer than that, then that is completely fine. This is just kind of a minimum guideline in terms of you couldn't respond to one of these questions in a shorter period of time properly enough. And of course, that page length is really a requirement for the accreditation, since you guys are getting college credit for this class. So that's why that is something that's really important to note. So any questions about the prompt as we move forward with this? Because I know we did break down the 4 questions last class. any questions or concerns, because of course, as we go over drafting today, the rough draft is due by 8 a.m. on Wednesday, so it is our fastest turnaround for a rough draft, and that's primarily so that we can have more time for conferencing and then more time for you guys to revise it. Since next Wednesday is Veterans Day. So any questions about the prompt or concerns about that? Okay, well, if any come up, just let me know as we move forward with this. So to begin with, before we get into drafting, you really want to figure out and get your ideas for, figuring out your claims. So what are your topic sentences going to be in terms of how you're responding to these questions, as well as brainstorming the different examples that you want to talk about, either from the sources or even other examples that come to mind. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out into small discussion groups so that you guys can share what specific question or questions you guys are planning on responding to from that prompt. So which one that you guys are leaning to in terms of the 4 prompt questions, discuss the different examples that you want to use to illustrate your points, and of course, what is it you want to say about the morality of cancel culture, and then just give each other feedback and advice in terms of if there's another example that comes to mind or something that your classmate hasn't necessarily noted that you feel like maybe they could add, so that we can really help with that brainstorming process. So we're going to get into those discussion groups now, and we're going to take about 15 to 20 minutes because, of course, there'll be 3 to 4 people per group, so that way everyone has a chance to share what they're thinking about responding to, and of course the examples that come to mind. So any questions before we break out into those sections? Or would it help to see the prompts, the 4 questions, just so you can kind of touch on those more? I see Val, you say yes. Is it yes in terms of seeing the 4 questions or in terms of getting, okay. So here's the prompt. So if you want to take a screen capture of that, because of course I can't share my screen and put you guys into breakout sessions. So if you guys want to take a picture of that, and then we'll take a moment for you guys to do that, and then we'll break out into those sections. But the prompt is also available in our Canvas shell, so you could also view it there. Okay, I see a number of you guys got it, so I'm going to stop the screen share and I'll put you guys into the groups, and we'll take some time. I will jump around to the different groups just to check in, but we should be reconvening into our large class session to talk about drafting roughly at 10:40 to 10:45, depending on where you guys are at. So you should get that invitation now for the breakout section. Looks like we only have 1 group of 4. So you want to accept that invitation. Again, so resume. So I have 1 question in the chat. So in terms of, are we limited to the 2 sources we read, watched in the class? So that was another question that I just answered in one of the groups. So in terms of that, you are welcome to use other outside sources. So the only thing for that, if you do choose to use other outside sources separate from 2 of the ones we used, or we talked about specifically in class, you just want to make sure to have the full works cited page citation and a proper in-text citation whenever you are citing or paraphrasing that other source. But you can, as long as it's cited properly. Any other questions before we get started? How would you cite a YouTube interview? So in terms of a YouTube interview, there is actually a citation guideline with MLA for YouTube. So let me pull up OWL Purdue. So if we go to OWL Purdue, which has, I think, the most thorough in terms of breaking down MLA format for all the different types of sources. If we go to their different works cited page options, they have electronic sources, and under electronic sources, there is a way to cite a YouTube video. Let's find it. Yeah, so if we scroll down, there's a way to cite the YouTube video. So if we think about, like, if you are citing a YouTube interview, right, it really, your in-text citation would depend on what information you have for that works cited page citation. So for instance, right, if there is a clear name in terms of who created that video, right, or who created kind of that interview, if we think, if you will, then you would cite like the last name of that person. However, right, sometimes if we think about YouTube videos, if there's just whatever the YouTube channel name isn't like a clear person, then you would start with the name of the video, and then in your in-text citation, it would be the first 3 words of that video. So there is that in terms of this. There's even a way to cite a tweet now. There are a lot of options in terms of it. So MLA OWL Purdue, the best resource because they do break it down really nicely. Sorry, my mouse is being a little finicky today. Oh, thank you for sending that link, Virginia. I really appreciate it. So Virginia sent that link for OWL Purdue if you want it. So any other questions before we kind of move towards drafting? Because as I mentioned earlier, drafting for this paper is a little different, especially because the organization for your thesis and your topic sentences are going to be really dependent on the questions that you are choosing to respond to for this paper. So the biggest thing for drafting in terms of figuring that out is planning your organization and figuring out kind of what are the points that you're wanting to make in response to that prompt. So in figuring out your claims, that is the first thing you want to do, right? So because of course, figuring out the claims, that is what we are going to be using in terms of then figuring out our thesis statement. So in terms of like kind of reverse organization. So when we're thinking of like strategies to do that, since of course, unlike our previous paper where we have like a set rhetorical analysis, set thesis, and wanting to make that connection, now we're wanting to just establish, okay, what are my statements that I'm going to be making in response to these questions and explaining about cancel culture, and then figuring out what are the language cues I use and how can I condense that into one thesis statement. So for this specifically, right, that is the biggest thing. And of course, one strategy that can be really helpful in figuring out this reverse organization is what we call a free write, which, have you guys ever done a free write in classes before? Is that familiar for you? To get a few yeses, sort of. So free writing is a brainstorming strategy. So what that means specifically is you are taking a little bit of time and you are just putting all of your thoughts out about a specific question. So it's a way of getting started with writing your essay and coming up with the specific points that come to mind first, which can be a really good way of identifying the main points that you want to make about that specific topic and figuring out those topic sentences. So free write, right, if we think about that, it forces us, when we have that limited amount of time, to just get those ideas out there instead of having to kind of really worry about the language and how we're phrasing them. So if we think about those questions, right, that you've chosen, free writing can be really beneficial if we think of, okay, so those are the questions, how would I answer them directly in a limited space, right? And then that would be how we come across and come to the individual topic sentences. So once we do that free write, then we can go through in terms of, okay, how can I break them down? Because each individual point would be a topic sentence for a new body paragraph. So that can really help us to figure out the individual points we're making and how we can divide them into the body paragraphs for our paper. And then we can go through that process of making sure that each point has a clear stance and is concrete. Because of course, if we think about the characteristics of a good topic sentence, they should be presenting a clear perspective of what's going to be explained, right? We never want to start with an example, or we never really want to start as kind of wishy-washy. And of course, depending on, right, our topic sentences, we want to make sure that they relate to one of the questions explicitly. So that is what, if we think about with our rhetorical analysis, like we're checking off those boxes to making sure that we're answering all of the questions we're being asked. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to take a little bit, and of course, you guys looking at the questions you've chosen and the ideas that you've had based on your classmates' comments and suggestions, we're going to take about 5 minutes. So you're just going to write out on a piece of paper on your computer, how would you respond to that in a paragraph? Sorry, I'm getting a little tickle in my throat. Excuse me. So we're going to take 5 minutes for this. So looking at those questions, right, we're going to do a 5-minute free write, respond to those questions in statements in a paragraph, and that's going to be how we're going to model getting to our thesis statement. So for this, as you guys are working, would it be more beneficial to have the prompt open or have kind of this slide open that's already there? What would be most beneficial for you guys? Okay, I resume recording. So with free writing, I'm really figuring out, right, how, so James had a question, sorry, before we get into, yes, so you should have a definition for cancel culture in the intro, which we'll get into in the next slide, actually. But first, it's figuring out specifically, after we've identified and defined cancel culture, we really want to center and figure out our topic sentences so we can figure out what we should have in our thesis statement. Because of course, your thesis statement, your topic sentence is going to depend specifically on the question or questions that you've chosen to respond to. So thinking about this as a question, say I'm only responding to question 1, right? We do have language cues here that are telling me, okay, so what should I have in my thesis and what should I be addressing in my topic sentences? So if you've chosen question 1, you in some way should be explicitly mentioning moral obligations, specifically for individuals and society. So that is what you're focusing on in terms of canceling offensive, inappropriate, or correct behaviors of others. So that is the language that I'd be wanting to focus on. So if I'm thinking about how I'd be responding to this for my topic sentences, I would be thinking, okay, how would I answer those questions in terms of the moral obligations? So individuals are morally obligated to correct others when they witness racist or inappropriate behavior Okay, if I would think about how I would answer that as well, I could say society is morally obligated to, trying to think of how, what do you think in terms of what is society morally obligated to do for offensive or inappropriate? I would say maybe society is morally obligated to protect others or to protect people from others' inappropriate or offensive actions. I would say another claim I could have in this situation are not
You could also talk about because that they feel that the platforms aren't doing a good enough job of canceling people.
Yeah. So it'd be definitely, this is getting real long now. So if we think about, I'm getting all of my ideas out there, I'm not elaborating, but okay, what are my ideas that I'd say? So yeah, so individuals are responsible for speaking out when the platform, so or even the corporation or platform isn't stopping inappropriate content. Yeah, that'd be really good. Anything else? Any other points that come to mind? Because James, we decide and enforce values. So in terms of that, that gets really complicated in terms of this, because of course, if we think about values, people value things differently depending on their moral code. So like, how would we present that connection when it comes to deciding and enforcing values? Maybe individuals shouldn't enforce, I don't know if that's the right word, or place their values on others. That language might be a little wonky. The example that comes to mind if we think about for that for me is religion and religious freedom. Any other points? So if we think about this, right, all of those are kind of how I would respond to those questions in statements. And now these can turn into my topic sentences. And of course, one thing that's really important to note here is, right, how I'm building this to my thesis is really focusing on, okay, what are the different language cues I've used as I've answered those questions? And of course, what does that mean? What language should I use in my thesis to properly introduce all of these responses? And then we had another individual shouldn't always decide what is offensive to groups that they might not be a part of. Yeah, that's definitely a good one. So if we think about it in terms of that language, right, what stands out to you guys about these claims that I've created? Any observations?
They're all pretty short.
Yeah, they're pretty short. So if we think about it, none of these claims have examples. So if you think about like a general rule, it's like we don't start with an example. Of course, if we present a concrete example in the claim that we're making, that really limits what we can focus on in terms of explaining. Because of course, as you have mentioned, right, with corporations in terms of, or platforms, right, if we're making that statement about platforms and we're only focusing on one, then that means we can't use examples of other corporations or other platforms. So it really depends on how much we're limiting the scope of our discussion, which you can, but it really depends on that choice that you want to make. So don't use concrete examples. Any other observations about these claims? If you think about it, I've answered these questions, but they also avoid first person. So they don't use I. So like, why would I have avoided responding to these questions with like, I believe or an I think? That's my opinion. Exactly. So I'm assessing and answering these, and I just want to explain my opinion, but I want to take out that bias and I want to explain these as fully as possible. So if I were to have responded to that question with I believe, I think, then this would be much shorter because I'm not breaking down the examples for other people. So it's really important for this paper to avoid using that first person so that you're being more direct and you're being more explicit in terms of those connections you're making. Any other observations or thoughts about these? So I do have a number of options. Let's see, I have 7 options here, right? Depending on the length of the paper, since it's 3 to 4 pages long, right? I may not use all of these. I would maybe choose which ones are most important to my responses, especially for that length if I want to keep it shorter, or I could use all of them if I really am passionate and I want to answer all of the questions as thoroughly as possible. So I do have options for me. And of course, if we think about that language we're connecting here, right? One thing that's really important, as you'll see, is in all of these examples, I am connecting to some language that's in that question. So in that first one, I have individuals, I have morally obligated, I have racist or inappropriate behavior. In the second one, I have society, morally obligated, any inappropriate or offensive actions, and so on, responsible, so society. And I have a variety of claims, because if we have to think about this, I go from are morally obligated, so fact, claim of fact, claim of fact, claim of, if we think of need to teach people, claim of value, claim of fact, and then claim of policy, claim of policy. So there's a variety of different ways that I've addressed this. And of course, looking at that language, if I want to, that I have here, those are the different keywords that I want to kind of present into my thesis statement. So figuring out like the one sentence response that will introduce and connect all of these different points that I've made. So like how would you guys word that based on the language cues here? Like what would my subject be?
Would the subject be the individuals?
So it'd be individuals and society, since I have claims that go back and forth between them. Obviously, I am focusing more on individuals, but my subject should be individuals and society in response. And then how would I proceed with that? Like what is the action for the sentence? How am I connecting it? Because I need to respond to that prompt question in that one sentence and introduce my different claims in that one sentence. So there's like a lot there. So it's like, I just need to limit kind of what language cues are most important. In responding to that. So we have Dan's example. So as individuals in society, there is a moral obligation to cancel others for offensive and inappropriate actions. So I can definitely or I could use the language as James said, individuals and society should cancel others if they commit inappropriate or offensive actions, right? Or I could have, if we think of the differences here, I could say like the moral obligations of individuals and society vary depending on the situation when it I would actually say to cancel others for individuals. That actually works better. So the moral obligations to cancel others for individuals and society vary depending on the situation. Because I have they are. If we think about that third one, right, it's not the individual's choice if it's illegal, it's society's choice. If we think about teaching people is not necessarily cancellation. So the moral obligation is different. So that's a way I can make that connection. So if we think about here, all three of these examples would work, and it touches on the key points that are made here, and I can make them depending on if I can make them more specific or less specific, depending on what I'm really focusing on. So any questions about that in terms of how we come to our thesis? Does that make sense now in terms of how we get to like the thesis kind of reverse planning? Awesome. So if you do have any questions, so So cancel be in the body paragraph. So in terms of the question about cancel culture definition being the body paragraph, since that is part of the question that we're answering in our thesis statement, you should define it earlier. So you should define it in the introduction and not in the body paragraph. You can become more specific in the body paragraph in terms of defining the different types of canceling or the different reasons that people are canceled. But we would want to have like a short definition of cancel culture in the intro at the very least. Long intro. So we're going to get into the intro actually right now. So any other questions in terms of planning out your body paragraphs and your thesis? Any other concerns with this? Before we move to our intro, thumbs up if you guys are good. Awesome. Okay. So moving to that intro, which hopefully should answer James's question, right? Our introduction is where we're really setting up the scene for how we're going to be explaining. So it is really important to define cancel culture, define this conversation that we're having and the perspective we're presenting about cancel culture through how we're answering these individual questions. So the overall goal of the intro, as we talked about previously, is we still want to follow that upside down triangle organization where we start broad and then we narrow our focus and ending in our thesis statement. So the biggest thing in terms of that concern about your intro being really long is figuring out like what are the necessary information or what information specifically is necessary for setting up the context for your thesis statement. So we want to keep the intro, right, to a decent size. We don't want it to be too long. As a general rule for this size paper is your introduction should never go on to that second page when we have a 3 to 4 page paper, just so we can get to the point, and the real kind of length of your essay would be in the body paragraphs where you're really doing the job of explaining. So we start with that hook. So the hook for you is really going to depend on what it is you want to emphasize in terms of the setting up the context for this conversation. So if you are concerned about going into too much depth about cancel culture, you can start with the option of just talking about the issue of morality or moral dilemmas. If we think about people have different moral codes or view morality in terms of their actions they need to take differently, like we talked about, you can introduce and talk about what morality is, or you can just start with that issue of cancel culture. So going into depth in terms of, in the last few years, there's been the rise of cancel culture in terms of individuals and society calling attention very publicly to the misdeeds of others in order to kind of bring awareness, but also to maybe in some cases unnecessarily punish people for actions that can be corrected otherwise. So really just defining what it is that biggest thing in terms of getting into why it's important, like what cancel culture it is in terms of why we're talking about it, right? Especially as I mentioned in terms of building to that thesis statement. After that, we want to introduce those two sources that you're going to be using from our readings, primarily because, right, they set the tone for the conversation that we are having within our papers, right? They are part of that entry point in terms of how we started this conversation and what we assessed as we gathered our ideas. So even though the thesis isn't reliant on them, right, we still want to kind of give them that shout out, I guess you would say. That would be pretty brief. If anything, maybe a sentence for each source that you're mentioning. If you are choosing to use outside sources separate from the two that we talked about, you do not need to introduce those in the introduction. because they are separate from our class discussions in terms of what set up our context for this analysis and for this discussion. And then one thing to note in terms of the author's full names, if you are using the documentary, you can just say CBSN Originals Documentary, just because that is the YouTube page that basically published or uploaded, I can't remember the correct term, in terms of that documentary to YouTube. So in terms of that, and then of course getting to our thesis statement. So any questions about the intro or concerns? So we have one now. Thumbs up if you guys are good. We can move forward. Okay, awesome. So moving to our body paragraphs, that is where you guys have more variety. Because as I noted before, your body paragraphs are really going to depend on those topic sentences that you created in terms of how you're answering those questions and how nuanced they're going to be. So the biggest thing in terms of this is those topic sentences. So the topic sentences, as we've talked about when we had that example, they should be concrete. They should have a clear stance. So making sure that they do explicitly connect to the question, they do explicitly connect back to the thesis statement that you've created. But then after that, you do have a number of options depending on how you want to address and explain that answer. Because the biggest kind of bulk of this is the examples that you want to present and how you're wanting to explain the scenario in terms of that statement that you made an answer as an answer to those questions. So for examples that you can have, it's really going to depend on what illustrates your points better. So as I mentioned, you do not necessarily need to have a textual example from our sources in every body paragraphs. You can, it's really up to you. The most important thing is if you're not using a textual example from them, you still want to have an example of a situation. So it could be an example of a specific person, corporation, or group that has been canceled, or even a hypothetical in terms of like a hypothetical situation in terms of like what somebody did and like what is the reaction to that or what should be done in response to that hypothetical. You can use a variety, right? So you could use numerous examples of people and hypotheticals, right? It's really going to depend on just what is explaining and illustrating your point the best. And the order of this really just depends on kind of what you are calling attention to in response to that question. The biggest thing for the body paragraphs that you do want to emphasize is you do want to analyze and discuss your examples and explain your reasoning in terms of what should be done or how they show the moral obligation, if that's your question. So that should be the biggest part of those body paragraphs, is really you doing the work and you going through and explaining kind of why people are morally obligated, or why in that situation somebody should choose to cancel somebody or not, or why if they were incorrect, why like they would be morally, how that would affect their morality. So that's really where the bulk of that should be. As a general rule in your body paragraphs is we never want to end with an example. You always want to end with your discussion, kind of like a sandwich that's working with your topic sentence to kind of clarify like what the audience should be taking away from those examples and what they should understand about those examples. So in terms of this, right, for the examples of specific people, corporations, groups, if you are referencing common knowledge or you're using what you already know, you do not need to cite it. But if you are referencing examples from another source, right, even if you're paraphrasing you would still want to cite it because, right, you're taking the idea of another person. So that's really good and very, but we did have a lot of examples we've talked about. And of course, even ones that are ever changing. Did you guys see the news about Johnny Depp this morning? No, because I know we had mentioned the whole kind of back and forth with Johnny Depp versus his ex-wife Amber Heard in terms of him being like the abuser versus the abused, and we took her side at first, and then the video of her verbally abusing him came out, and then that really kind of complicated it. I guess like I can't remember what country it was, but he had sued, I want to say it was the UK, but I may be wrong, but he had sued for libel, which a libel case is, of course, when somebody is making untrue, damaging claims about somebody, you can sue them for libel. Against, I want to say, a publication there for calling him a wife beater, and he just lost that case. So it's kind of interesting in terms of what that means for his whole cancellation, that a judge or jury, I can't remember who tried it, didn't view it as libel in terms of that. Yeah. So talking about those examples, there are a number of the ones that we've mentioned. Okay, so the Sun tabloid, which is English, yeah. A UK-based tabloid. Yeah, so referencing those examples. Any questions about body paragraphs or concerns? As we move forward. Thumbs up if you guys are good. I see one thumbs up, a few more, awesome. So moving towards our conclusion, right? Similar to how we organized our conclusions previously, we would follow that triangle formation. So mirroring how we would organize our introduction. So starting by restating our thesis statement at the very beginning as that signal to readers that you're wrapping up your paper, that you're not going to be presenting any more examples or any more claims in response to that question. And then how we progress, we want to end broad. So of course, with that, like one thing to note for conclusions is we do want to avoid summarizing the points you've already presented, primarily because you've already presented them. We want to avoid that repetition. So in ending broad, right, we have some other options, right? If we think about mirroring your introduction, like you could end broad by discussing kind of a call to action about cancel culture or call for change if you're focusing on cancel culture being good, or even a call for change if you're saying like we need to cancel people in order to change society so it's better for more people, I guess you would say. Or you could end by emphasizing moral questions or moral dilemmas, or if we think about how emphasizing how everyone has different morals and it's all about figuring out what is best for even the individual or for society, that's really up to you. The biggest thing is ending broad in terms of this, and yeah. Questions. One thing to avoid, you never want to present a new example in your conclusion. So that's something to avoid. But we've talked a lot about conclusions. Questions, concerns. So Dan's is not here. because I did want to end with your questions. So in terms of this, since we have like roughly 35 or so minutes left of class, I did want to end with time where I can give you guys more one-on-one feedback in terms of breaking down your topic sentences or looking at the ones that you came up with during your free write. So I can give you the feedback on that since we didn't have an outline this time. So we did have the one question, so how long should a rough draft be? So the rough draft, since our final draft should be 3 to 4 full pages, and of course this is the fastest turnaround for a rough draft we've had, you do want to have the rough draft be somewhere on that third page. If the third page is not a full page, then that won't go against you, but you should be somewhere, at least the beginning part of that third page for that rough draft. And of course, the rough draft is due by 8 a.m. on Wednesday, and we start conferencing. So if you haven't signed up for conferencing yet, you do want to look at the schedule. Our conferencing for this paper begins on Wednesday, so it'll be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then Monday and Tuesday. Because of course, as I said earlier, next Wednesday is Veterans Day, so there is no class next Wednesday. So any other questions about the paper? You can choose 2 questions to write about, that's true. So in terms of breaking that down, any issues with that or any questions? So you could do the same thing in terms of the free writing your claims, because a lot of them are interconnected. In terms of those questions, you can combine them pretty nicely. So we will have the next 35 minutes for me giving advice for those who need it more one-on-one, writing about 2 leading into that third question. I think that would be a good call, because I did, when I designed the 4 questions, I designed them so that they would work well together in terms of all 4, if you choose like any of the 2 would work together. So that would work. Okay. So if not, so in terms of, I will be staying on the Zoom for the remainder of our class for more one-on-one feedback in terms of looking at your free writes and giving you suggestions in terms of the points and how you're responding to the questions in your topic sentences, or even condensing it for your thesis. So in terms of our schedule, as I said, the rough draft is due by 8 a.m. on Wednesday. The peer reviews are due by the end of the day on Friday. And of course, individual conferences starting Wednesday through next Tuesday. And so we don't have next class next Monday or Wednesday. Okay, so that is it for today. So it was great chatting with you guys. For those who need help or questions, you guys can stay. Otherwise, have a good one. I will see you during your individual conference.